My name is Beatrice Langston. I am 84 years old. And the night my son and his wife laughed at me, really laughed, as though I were nothing more than an old joke in their perfect little world, was the night something inside me broke, and then hardened. It was a Thursday evening. Rain drummed against the windows, the kind of steady rhythm that made the house feel smaller, tighter. I was in the living room, folding linens because it was one of the few chores they still allowed me to do. I like to keep my hands busy. It made me feel useful, even when their voices reminded me daily that I wasn't. I could hear them in the kitchen. They thought the half-shut door muted them. Didn't. She moves so slowly, Tom, her voice, Vanessa's, carried sharp and thin like glass breaking. Everything takes her forever. She's just in the way. My son's reply came, low but without hesitation. She's old, Ness. That's what happens. She's useless now. We're basically caring for another child. My breath caught. My fingers stilled on the sheet I had been folding. And then came the sound I'll never forget. Their laughter. Together. Me. The boy I had carried into this world, who once clung to me with fevered skin and whispered, "Don't leave me, Mom," now laughed with his wife about how useless I was. Useless. I sat perfectly still, the sheet trembling in my lap, every muscle taut as their words twisted inside me. Well, useless. In the way. Vanessa's voice rose again, smug. Honestly, I can't wait until she's not here. Then the house will really be ours. Not here. The word struck like lightning. For years I had lived in their home, quiet, careful, stepping around their moods. I told myself it was family, that being with my son after his father passed was a gift. I told myself I still mattered. But hearing those words, hearing the laughter, stripped everything away. When the door swung open a few minutes later, they walked through as though nothing had happened. Vanessa smiled politely at me, the same tight smile she wore for strangers. My son glanced at the folded sheets, nodded absently, and moved on. They didn't know I had heard. They didn't care. Later, alone in my room, I pressed my hands together, trembling with rage and sorrow. I looked around at the space that was mine. The dresser scarred with age, the quilt I had sewn years ago, the framed photo of my late husband smiling on our wedding day. My life had been whittled down to scraps, to quiet corners, to folding linens while they planned for a future without me. But something inside me whispered through the grief. They think you're old. They think you're useless. They think you're in the way. But the day they laughed was the day you stop being weak. And one day soon you'll take back everything they think is theirs. That night, as rain battered the house and their laughter echoed in my head, I whispered into the darkness. They'll regret every word. 'Cause I'm not done. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. Thomas wasn't always cruel. I have to remind myself of that when the bitterness creeps in, when the sound of his laughter with Vanessa rings like a wound I can't close. He wasn't always the man who called me useless. Once he was my pride, my purpose, my reason for waking up when grief tried to bury me. I had Thomas late in life, 40 years old, gray already streaking my hair, hands worn from years of sewing in a factory. The doctor had told me not to hope, that age and fate had likely closed that door. But then there he was, wailing in my arms, his fist clutched tight around my finger. I whispered into his tiny ear that day, "You will never be alone. Not while I breathe." When his father, Henry, died of a sudden stroke when Thomas was just 11, that promise became my anchor. Thomas sobbed at the funeral, pressing his face into my dress, his little body trembling. "It's just us now, Mom," he whispered. "Just us." "Yes, darling," I told him, stroking his hair. "Just us. Always." And so it was. I worked myself into exhaustion to give him what he needed. Days at the sewing machine, nights taking in mending from neighbors. My fingers bled, my back ached. But when Thomas came home from school with books in his bag and dreams in his eyes, it felt worth it. I skipped meals so he could eat full plates. I patched my shoes so he could have new ones. I pawned my wedding band once to pay for his school trip to Washington, D.C. He never knew, I wouldn't let him. He was bright. Teachers said he had a future beyond the factory gates. I believed them. I pushed him gently but firmly to study, to dream bigger. And when he graduated from college, I clapped until my palms were raw, tears streaming as he walked across that stage. Afterward he hugged me tight. "We did it, Mom," he said. "Not I did it. I lived for that we." Things began to change when he met Vanessa. She was dazzling in the way city lights are dazzling. Too bright, too sharp, blinding if you stare too long. She wore perfume that clung to every room she entered, heels that clicked like punctuation marks, and a smile that never reached her eyes. When Thomas brought her home the first time, she shook my hand lightly, her gaze flicking over me as though measuring the worth of my thrifted dress and calloused hands. "Charming house," she said, her tone flat. I tried to ignore it. I wanted to love her for his sake. But the little comments began almost immediately. "You keep so many old things, Beatrice. Don't you ever throw anything out?" Or, "That stew smells hearty. Thomas isn't used to food like this anymore." Always with a smile, always light, but sharp enough to sting. And Thomas, my sweet boy who once defended me against playground bullies, began to change in her shadow. First it was subtle. He chuckled at her remarks, brushed them off. Then he began repeating them himself. "Mom, maybe it's time to modernize a little. Mom, you really do tell the same stories over and over." Little cracks. Hairline fractures in the bond we had built. When my health began to falter, the arthritis in my knees worsening, the dizzy spells creeping in, Thomas suggested I move in with them. "It'll be easier, Mom," he said. "You won't have to worry about bills or the house. You'll be with family." Sounded like a blessing. I sold my little home, the place where Henry's memory lingered in every corner, and gave the proceeds to Thomas to help with expenses. I told myself it was a new chapter, that I would be surrounded by love. But the moment I carried my boxes through their gleaming doorway, I felt it. This was Vanessa's kingdom. I was a guest in my own son's home. First they were polite. A room was given to me, small but neat. Meals were shared, though Vanessa often critiqued my portions or sighed when I asked about adding salt. Then came the sighs when I entered a room. The exchanged glances when I spoke. The way conversations shifted when I joined in, as though my presence dimmed the air. One evening, as I told their children about how Thomas once caught fireflies in jars to light his room, Vanessa interrupted with a laugh. "Grandma does go on, doesn't she?" Thomas chuckled. "She does." The children laughed too, uncertain, following their parents' cue. That was the night I felt the first real crack split wide inside me. I sat awake later, staring at the ceiling, hearing their laughter echo. My boy, my miracle, my reason for everything, had joined the chorus against me. And I thought, if he can laugh with her at me, then one day, I'll make sure the laughter isn't mine to bear. It'll be theirs to choke on. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The night that broke me wasn't just about words spoken behind doors. It was about the way those words stepped out into the open, unashamed, wielded like weapons in front of witnesses. It was Vanessa's birthday. The house smelled of roasted chicken and expensive candles, the kind that burn more for display than for light. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends filled the living room, glasses clinking, laughter echoing off the polished walls. I had been told to keep a low profile. "Just stay upstairs, Mom," Thomas said gently but firmly earlier that day. "It's easier. You know how you linger on stories. People don't always get it." I nodded, swallowing the sting. But as the night wore on, the muffled sounds of celebration tugged at me. I wanted only to see, to smile, to show my face for a moment. To remind myself I wasn't invisible. So I came down the stairs, careful, slow, my cane tapping softly against the steps. When I reached the doorway, conversations faltered. Eyes turned. I smiled, small and shy, clutching the rail. "I just wanted to wish Vanessa a happy birthday," I said. For a moment, silence held the room. And then Vanessa laughed. "Beatrice," she said brightly, her wine glass in hand. "Of course you'd wander down. I swear, Tom, your mother has radar for attention. She just can't help herself." Laughter rippled around her friends. I froze, my smile faltering. Thomas's face flushed, but instead of defending me, he chuckled nervously. "That's Mom for you. Talks too much, always in the middle of things." The laughter grew louder. Heat surged up my neck, my cheeks burning. My fingers tightened around the cane until my knuckles whitened. I wanted to shout, to remind them that the only reason Thomas had a roof over his head was because I had worked myself to the bone. That Vanessa wore diamonds while I wore worn shoes because I had sold half my life to give him a future. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood there, trembling as Vanessa stepped closer, her smile sharp. "And that smell," she said, her voice pitched loud enough for everyone. "Like old attics. It clings to her, doesn't it?" The laughter this time was unrestrained. Something inside me cracked. Not a small fissure, but a shattering. I turned, my eyes burning with tears I refused to shed in front of them, and climbed the stairs one heavy step at a time. Behind me, their laughter carried on, muffled only when the door to my room clicked shut. I sank onto the bed, my body shaking, my chest tight. For the first time in my life, I wished the air would simply stop filling my lungs. The photo of Henry on the dresser stared back at me, his smile frozen in a time when life still held warmth. I whispered into the silence, "You'd be ashamed of what they've become. Of what he's become." My chest heaved as sobs clawed out of me, raw and unrelenting. The humiliation, the betrayal, the cruel laughter. It all churned inside until there was nothing left but emptiness. 4 days afterward, I barely moved. Meals were left untouched. Words stayed locked behind clenched teeth. The house bustled with life around me, but I lived in a coffin of silence. I thought maybe this was it, the slow fade they wanted. Maybe I would become the invisible shadow they already believed me to be. But then, one night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I remembered my promise to Thomas when he was 11. "You will never be alone. Not while I breathe." And then I thought, hadn't he already left me alone? Hadn't he chosen her laughter over my love? That was the moment despair turned into something sharper, something colder. Not death, not surrender, but the seed of vengeance. I whispered into the dark, my voice low but steady. "They laughed at me. They think I am useless." But the day they laughed was the day I stopped being afraid. One day soon, they'll choke on the life they've built on my back. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? After that birthday humiliation, something in me went still. Not broken. Not dead. Just still, the way a snake is still before it strikes. For a few days, I let them think they had won. Vanessa clattered through the house in her heels, tossing glances at me like I was a stain on the furniture. Thomas avoided my eyes, his guilt shallow, fleeting, not enough to turn into action. They thought I was retreating further into silence, that I was fading just as they wanted. But in the silence I was plotting. Every corner of their house whispered of me. The money I gave them from selling my own home. The quilt on the back of the couch I had sewn. The photo albums on the shelves. Every picture carefully preserved by my hands. Even the mortgage. Because the truth was, when I sold my house and moved in with Thomas, it was my savings that had pulled them out of the hole they'd been in. My name wasn't on the deeds they showed off, but my money built their so-called stability. They laughed as though I were useless, but they were standing on a foundation I had poured with my own blood. And suddenly I saw it for what it was: leverage. They thought they owned everything, but much of it was mine. And if I could not reclaim their love, I could reclaim what I had given. I started slowly, carefully, like a thief moving through the dark. Old receipts I had tucked away. Bank statements. Transfer slips. Notes scribbled in margins. Every scrap of evidence that showed what I had poured into their lives, what they had taken and claimed as their own. When Thomas had begged for help with the down payment, I had written the check. When Vanessa had insisted on renovating the kitchen, I had covered the contractor's deposit. They laughed at my old ways, but it was my old ways that kept them afloat. Piece by piece, I gathered proof. Each night, I slid papers into a folder I hid beneath my mattress. Each line of ink was not just memory, it was ammunition. Meanwhile, upstairs I played my part. I shuffled slowly, spoke less, smiled faintly. When Vanessa muttered that I was quiet for once, I let her think she had one. When Thomas sighed and told me not to worry about helping, I nodded. I was invisible, and invisibility is a powerful disguise. Because when no one is looking, you can prepare for anything. One afternoon, at the library where Vanessa assumed I only went to keep busy, I asked about legal workshops. The librarian, a kind woman who didn't treat me like dust, handed me a pamphlet. It explained how financial contributions could be documented, how property disputes could be contested if funds had been misused. I read every line. 3 times. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of possibility. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. The power they thought I no longer had. And then an idea struck me. Why confront them quietly, in a lawyer's office, where they could spin the story as they pleased? Why let them bury the truth in paperwork and signatures? Well, they had mocked me in front of others. They had laughed at my expense with neighbors, friends, colleagues. So my revenge had to be public. Loud. Devastating. The day they laughed would be the day the town saw them for who they truly were. As I slid the growing folder of evidence beneath my mattress that night, I whispered into the dark. They think everything here belongs to them. But soon the whole town will know it was mine. And when the truth comes out, they'll lose more than money. They'll lose the very image they laugh behind. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The Maplewood Town Hall was never glamorous. Beige walls, wooden floors polished to a dull shine, rows of folding chairs set up for meetings that drew more gossip than governance. But that night, it gleamed in my eyes like a stage. The meeting was packed. Neighbors, business owners, families, and yes, my son and his wife. They were seated near the front, dressed sharply as always. Thomas in his tailored jacket, Vanessa in a silk blouse that shimmered under the fluorescent lights. They were smiling, laughing, basking in the attention of their peers. I waited at the back, folder clutched to my chest, cane steady at my side. My heart pounded not with fear, but with anticipation. Because tonight, the laughter would die in their throats. When the moderator opened the floor for community concerns, I rose. The crowd shifted as I walked slowly down the aisle, cane tapping against the wood. Some faces lit with surprise, others with curiosity. My name was whispered like an echo. Beatrice Langston. I reached the front, opened my folder, and looked out at the sea of faces. My voice, steady and clear, filled the room. My name is Beatrice Langston. I am 84 years old, and I have a story to tell. Not about the past, but about what's happening now. In this very town, in a house not far from here. The crowd leaned in. I lifted a page. Years ago, I sold my home. I poured my savings into my son's house. Paid for renovations, down payments, contractors. I gave until my hands were empty, believing it was for family. I turned toward Thomas and Vanessa, my eyes sharp. And in return, I was given a corner room. I was told I smelled like dust, that I talked too much, that I was useless, and they laughed at me. My son and his wife laughed, in their kitchen at their dinner parties in front of neighbors. They mocked the very woman who made their comfort possible. Gasps rippled through the hall. Heads turned sharply toward Thomas and Vanessa, their smiles frozen in horror. I laid out the evidence, receipts, transfers, records, each page rustling like a hammer on stone. This house they boast about, it was built on my sacrifice. This image they parade before you hides cruelty. And tonight I will not be silent. The room erupted in whispers, outrage, pity, but none of it was for them. It was for me. I looked at my son, his face pale, his jaw tight. Vanessa sat stiff, her hand gripping his arm, her smile gone. One man stood. Is this true, Thomas? Did you really treat your mother this way? Another woman shook her head. I always wondered why she never came around anymore. The whispers grew louder, angrier, spreading like wildfire. Thomas finally spoke, his voice cracking. Mom, it's not how it sounds. But it was too late, because I had already spoken, and the town had already heard. I closed the folder, tucked it under my arm, and leaned on my cane. You called me useless. You called me old. You laughed. But now the whole town knows who you really are. And I'm done. Done being quiet. Done being in the way. I turned, cane tapping against the floor as I walked up the aisle. The crowd parted, eyes following me, some nodding in respect, others whispering with indignation at the pair I left behind. I didn't look back. In the days that followed, the fallout was merciless. At the grocery store, people avoided Thomas and Vanessa. At his workplace, whispers chased him down hallways. Clients canceled. Friends drifted. Their perfect image was shattered. Their laughter silenced, replaced with shame. And me. I took my folder of papers to a lawyer who listened intently, nodded, and filed what needed to be filed. Within months, a portion of what I had given them was legally returned. Enough for me to find a modest apartment of my own. Enough to prove that useless still had power. The first night in my new place, I sat by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands. For the first time in years I felt free. Weeks later Thomas came knocking. Alone, his face drawn. Mom, he said softly, you ruined us. Why? We could have handled this privately. I met his eyes, calm and cold. You laughed at me. In public. So I made sure the whole town laughed at you. Privately was never an option. He flinched, shoulders sagging. And when he left, I shut the door without a word. Behind it, I whispered to myself. The day they laughed was the day I stopped being theirs. And the day I took back everything they thought was theirs. They thought I would fade quietly. They thought my silence meant surrender. But I had proof, I had my story, and I had a voice that refused to die. One night was all it took to strip their false smiles away and make the whole town see them for what they really were. I walked away free, and they were left with the ruins of their own cruelty. For more stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold, subscribe now, because the next one might just be darker.